Today, we're very excited to be joined by David Nakaji, winemaker of Sebastiani Winery, and he's also a Yaley himself. So Mr. Nakaji started his career in chemistry, attaining a PhD in physical organic chemistry from Yale, but soon realized that wine was the route he wanted to take because of the mix of science and craft. Being the scholar he was, he went to get his final master's degree in viticulture and enology from UC Davis, which brought him to Northern California. Upon graduation, David worked several harvests throughout the world: Cakebread cellars in Napa, Domaine Louis Latour in Burgundy, and Chateau Thabig in Australia. His impression of Sebastiani Winery was that of a great old place full of history. Today, he is thrilled to be working in Sonoma County, which in his words is in the sweet spot, not too hot, not too cold, making it possible in a very short distance to find great spots for Pinot, Cabernet, and everything in between. Before we turn the mic over to David, I also just wanted to take a moment and introduce Jessica Heffernan, who is the New York State Manager for Foley Family Wines. With all that said, I hope you guys are as ready as I am to enjoy some really fabulous wines, and I will now turn it over to David.
Do you want to say a few words first?
I do. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, David and Michael and Julia. Thank you so much. And Angie for all your help as well. Angie's our other Foley person on the call coming from California. And, you know, to those of you joining us tonight, this dinner has been in the works for like 1.5 years. I'm not exaggerating. It has been in the works for so long. And to have it postponed till March, because that was the next available. And then obviously March happened. So I'm beyond excited to be here with you all tonight and have David here to speak to you. As you know, through the Foley Food and Wine Society link, you were able to purchase a bundle of these wines that will remain active for a period of time. I will get back to you and have Michael and Julia let you know exactly for how long. But I really just want to say again, thank you, David, for making these beautiful wines. And thank you, Angie, for all of your help in coordinating this. It was, you know, it's difficult in these times to do that. And obviously, Michael and Julia, again, for all of your time and attention. So let's everyone raise a glass and I think enjoy a beautiful evening together. So cheers. Thanks, Michael.
Cheers.
All right, am I on? Okay. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening or afternoon for my case. You know, they always say it's 5:30 somewhere, so it's my 5:30. Since I'm enjoying it with you folks, never too early to start, right? So yeah, I'll just start off telling you a little bit about myself. You got the thumbnail bio. Started out in chemistry. I think unless you're lucky enough to come from a family that owns a winery, I didn't even know that winemaking could be a career. And so it was kind of, after going through a lot of other things, I realized that this was a great, I mean, who wouldn't want to be a winemaker, right? It's like, what do? You taste wine, and there's actually a lot of hard work involved, but it's also a lot of fun. So yeah, I was at Yale from '86 to '92, got my PhD there, went back to school at Davis, and have been on the wine track ever since. I've been here at Sebastiani for 4 years after having worked several other places in Napa Valley, including BV, Acacia, and Visatui Winery, among other things. And Sebastiani is a great place. It's one of the oldest continuously operating wineries in California. 1904 is when it was founded, and worked right through Prohibition. So Sebastiani had the good luck to supply the sacramental wine for the Archbishopric of San Francisco. So they kept producing right through Prohibition and never stopped. It's very lucky because most people, something like 80% of the wineries in California went out of business at that time, maybe even more. So we are one of the few that have that continuous history. Sebastiani's always been a sort of Sonoma-focused winery, and we've continued that today. I think looking at the selection you had to choose from, you have some great wines there. Let's see what else. One of the nice things about being in Foley family is that Bill Foley loves vineyards. So normally at a winery this size, you're mostly making wine out of fruit you buy from other people. But for us, we have a lot of our own vineyards. We do a lot of our own source. You know, we source a lot from properties that Bill owns, and he owns properties up and down the state, all the way from Santa Barbara to Washington State, and you know, a little bit of everything in between. And if you haven't, pour yourself a glass, because you know this isn't. You can get loud and rowdy since you're all muted. It doesn't interrupt at all. And if you have a white, start with a white. I personally have the rosé in my glass. This is the Carneros Rose. It's a rosé of 100% Pinot Noir. It comes off the same vineyard that our Robert's Pinot Noir comes off of, which is located about 2 miles from the winery down in Carneros. And Carneros is, for those of you who don't know, is situated right along San Francisco Bay. And so even though it's only 2 miles from the winery, it has that bay influence. And every night it gets cold. Every day it warms up, so you can get good ripening in the grapes. And it's a nice spot to grow Pinot Noir. Even though you would think we were a little too warm if you just looked at the big map. As you move north in Sonoma Valley, we'll get to try some other things. For those of you who decided to pick the Cherry Block's located right across the street from the winery. And so even though it's only 2 miles from Carneros, it's right up against the Mayacamas Mountains. And that kind of prevents the cool breezes from circulating. It stays a little bit warmer, and it makes it a perfect spot for ripening Cabernet. Cherry Block's a really unique site. It's got these sort of deep, decomposed volcanic soils. They're older soils, but it's fairly well drained. And the really cool thing about it is that the vineyard was planted in 1962. And it's some of the oldest still producing Cabernet vines in the state. That's really old for an American vineyard. I know in France you'll see Cabernet vineyards reach 100 pretty routinely, but you have to remember that the United States is where phylloxera originated, and so we actually have more strains of phylloxera than they have to deal with in Europe, more vine pests, and so it's pretty hard to get a vine to live past 40 or 50 years here. And so 62, you're getting up there at 60, and it's actually still producing a pretty good crop. We get 2 to 3 tons an acre depending on the year, and which is good for everybody because it means you can still find it. It's not so rare that you can't buy a bottle. I'm just going to go through the list that I have of what you had selected. The white wine is the Sonoma County Chardonnay. Now this is a special Sonoma County Chardonnay we do. We do a wholesale blend that's North Coast, and this is for wine club and limited distribution. And so it allows me to kind of cherry pick lots because it's a few thousand cases out of a total production of maybe 50,000 cases. So kind of pick the best of the best to sneak in here. And again, this is mostly Carneros, so cooler climate. Hopefully you can taste that in the wine. It's going to be a little more sort of citrus driven, but Carneros is not super cool. It does allow you to get some of those stone fruit and riper flavors. And this wine gets a nice dose of oak. It's not overly oaked. One of the philosophies I've brought to Sebastiani, or continued at Sebastiani, I should say, is trying to make approachable, drinkable wines. I'm not really trying to make showstoppers because I feel like those wines really tire the palate They taste great in a tasting, in a flight, where you're just tasting the wine, spitting it out, moving to the next wine. You go, wow, that wine really stands out. But you bring that bottle home, you open it for dinner, and you get to the second glass and you kind of feel like, woof, that thing's heavy. I want to move on to something else. And I try to avoid making wines like that. I think wine and food are intimately connected. I think wine's a part of life and should be enjoyed that way. So I try to keep the acid up. I try to pick a little earlier than you might, and just make a nice, enjoyable, fresh, but still fairly serious bottle of wine. Most of these wines will age pretty well, especially some of the cabs. The cherry block, I've had 20-year-old cherry blocks that still taste, still have primary fruit, really fresh, bright, which is just amazing. It says so much about the site and the winemaking that's been here at Sebastiani for so many years. After that, what do we got? We have the Dry Creek Zinfandel. This is purchased fruit. So we have a long-term contract with a grower up in Dry Creek Valley. And we've made this Zinfandel now for, well, since before I got here, I think about 10 years. Dry Creek's a really nice spot for Zinfandel. It's kind of sheltered, gets a little warmer. Zinfandel really responds to that. And same thing, I'm not picking, Zinfandel, you can let it hang to 30 bricks. I'm trying to get it around 25, 26, get it into the winery where it still has some of that red fruit character, not so jammy and heavy. Gravel Bed Red is a fun blend that the winemaker who preceded me, Mark Lyon, came up with. Don't ask me what's in it because it changes every year. Some years it's more Merlot, some years it's more Cab. The 16 actually has a little chunk of Zinfandel in it. There's also Petit Syrah. It's just meant to be approachable, easy to drink, fruit forward, fun. It's also a wine, this wine will age 5, 10 years or more, depending on the blend. After that, we move up to the Cabernet. Sonoma County Cabernet is, it's another blend that we do for Wine Club and a limited distribution. And so it's also where I've kind of gone in and snuck out some good lots out of larger blends and put together something a little better, a little more special for tasting room and Wine Club. Like I said before, Sonoma County, this is actually mostly Sonoma Valley fruit. And it's, I'm trying to read and I can't read, so I'm gonna ignore it. So in Sonoma Valley, if you've ever been out here, Sonoma Valley runs north-south, and at the southern end of Sonoma Valley, you're in Carneros. At the northern end, it's actually quite warm, and so you have a whole variety of microclimates, which makes it really interesting for making wine. You can get all different styles just by going a few miles up or down valley, depending on what you're looking for. Most of the wineries we use for this Sonoma County Cab are located from just a few vineyards right around the winery. We have a long-term grower, Ted Nagel at Nathanson Creek, and a lot of his grapes go into this. It's just around the corner from Cherry Block, actually, a little bit different site. But again, it's probably a little bit of a less ripe style than you might find in some places, but I think it pairs really well with food, and it will age. It should age very well. Let's see.
David, so that comment from Anne was actually about the Chardonnay, saying that it's interesting, it's very clean, very oaky, very unusual for Chardonnay. Can you speak a little bit on why that might be different than what people have tried before?
Yeah, so it's a Carneros Chardonnay for the most part. It's going to be from vineyards along the bay. We own 3 vineyards just 2 miles south of the winery. We have the Patrick's Vineyard, we have Champlain Creek and Ramal, and they're all facing right up against the bay. And so that cooler climate is going to give you those citrusy notes. When Chardonnay gets riper, it tends to go first to sort of stone fruit, peach, apricot, pear sometimes. And then if you let it go beyond that, it actually kind of just tastes very bland. And Chardonnay is one of those grapes that they call it a winemaker's grape because you can do anything you want to it. The base is actually very subtle, and you can layer a lot onto it. So, you know, the classic California style is to hammer it with oak and make an oak bomb, which many people enjoy. I'm not saying it's wrong, but you can do everything in between. And so this is a cooler Chardonnay, and it's just going to show a little more of that sort of citrus zest. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you, and please continue down the rest of your list.
Yeah, and then we'll finish with Cherry Block Cab. And like I said, Cherry Block, 1962. I've done a couple of these tastings from Cherry Block. It's a little more difficult sometimes. There's a little bit of wind this afternoon, so the wind noise gets kind of annoying. So I'm not out there today. But it's something, if you ever come to the winery, ask for a tour of Cherry Block. It's really fun to see. The vines are about 6-8 inches thick. They look like little tree trunks. And you know, they're 58 years old, so they're almost 60 years old at this point, and still going strong. And it really is a unique site. It's 25 acres, 12 acres are the old vine section. There's Merlot in there, and then there's what we call the young vines, which are actually from 2004. So anywhere else other than Sebastiani, that counts as a mature vine, but since they're being compared to the oldsters, they're still called the young vines. Does anyone have any questions, or I can keep rattling?
We can always take questions throughout if anyone wanted to put them through the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature if you click participants to let me know if you have a question, and I'll unmute you to ask it. But David, while everyone's thinking, I would like to hear a little bit about, I mean, you stepped into the reins of the winemaker position at Sebastiani. Obviously, every winery has kind of their style, but obviously you have your own style. So how does that work when you take on the reins at an existing winery?
Yeah, it can be either really easy or really contentious, depending on what you're coming into. One of the reasons I really was excited about taking this job was that Mark Lyon, who had the position before me, was retiring after 37 years, and he produced wine in the very same style that I prefer, very fresh, food friendly. And so coming in, I didn't really have to change the style. I was able to just continue in what they had already been doing, but it can be a pretty big battle if you come in and you want to make big changes to the style, and then it's always arm wrestling with the marketing department and the owners and whoever else is. In the end, the owner gets to choose, but luckily our owner has enough wineries that we all kind of produce our own style, and that's what makes Foley Family unique, is that each winery is making its own style of wine.
So we have a question asking, given that you have this scientific background, do you think that your approach to winemaking is different than other people who don't have that type of basis behind them?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, having a science background, for me, the parts of winemaking that other people find difficult are really easy because the science is pretty basic in winemaking. There's not a heck of a lot of complication there. And so I don't really have to worry about those parts. And I think it helps me keep my winemaking fundamentally sound. There's a lot of fad in winemaking where people try stuff because they've heard it and they might not necessarily understand why not it would work. And so I see people chasing fads that I don't consider, you know, fundamentally sound. There's a lot of myths in wine about you know, adding acid, adding water, how things interact, and I tend not to follow those kind of fads. I stick to what I think are the most important things are making sure the grapes are treated the right way in the vineyard, trying to pick them at the right time so you're at optimal flavor, and then not doing anything in the winery that's going to ruin the wine. I mean, that's one of the truisms in winemaking, is that everything's downhill the moment you pick the grapes, and you just try not to screw it up when it gets into the winery. And there is a certain amount of truth to that. There's a lot of bad things that can happen in the winery, and there's only a few good things. So definitely try to avoid the bad things.
And very data driven, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, you gotta have good numbers, otherwise you're chasing, chasing down the rabbit hole otherwise.
So we have 3 questions that just came in. So first one, as we understand it, soil is key for the taste of a wine. Is there a specific reason you chose your location to impart flavor into your wine?
Well, I mean, you don't actually get the opportunity to choose your soil for the most part. Vineyards are where vineyards are, and it's very expensive to replant. It's about $50,000 an acre to replant a vineyard. So yeah, when you see somebody replant a 100-acre vineyard, they've put a fair amount of money into that. It doesn't produce grapes for 3 years. And in year 4, you start bringing in a crop. So you've invested all that money. It takes 4 years before you even start to see a return. And so, you're kind of locked in to whatever the site is going to give you. But where you see that becoming really important is we have single vineyard wines, where things like Cherry Block, where clearly the site is special. The soil, the way the grapes interact with the soil and the microclimate, it just produces something special. And as a winemaker, I have the fortunate job of raising my hand and saying, oh, this is one we should keep separate. It doesn't need to go into the big blend. We should do a special bottling if we can. And so that's where you really see that. So there are very few people who actually get to choose their soil. That would be nice.
So we have a question from Katie, a little similar, asking, can you talk about how the decisions are made as to what goes into the gravel bed red wine?
Yeah, that's it's kind of a mishmash. It's a little bit of just what do I have sitting around, and then what's going to go well together. So usually I'll look at the portfolio we have, and if there's a lot of anything extra, that'll often form the base. So some years, you'll have a really good Merlot crop, so you have more Merlot than you're going to bottle in your Merlot bottling. And some years something just tastes really good. It's like, oh, this is really special this year. And then you start building from there. Some, Merlot can be a little light, a little kind of one-dimensional fruity. Cab can be a little heavy, a little too tannic. And so when I'm putting the blend together, I'm trying to average out those components to make a nice full round wine. And so usually you start with something that you have a lot of, and then you start layering on the other pieces to get to where you want it to be. And so you have that sort of target wine in mind. And then you just go from there and add on the layers. And it's always different.
Of course. And speaking of tannins, question from Steven saying that they've noticed that the Zinfandel feels drying in the mouth. Can you comment on the effect that tannins have on the mouthfeel of the wines you create, and what food you would recommend to pair with highly tannic wines?
Yeah, so the Zinfandel's not a super tannic wine. That one is actually a fairly big Zinfandel. The 17 was a really nice year. Things got pretty ripe and big, and so it kind of lent itself to being that kind of wine. Tannins come from 2 places. They come from the barrels we use, and they're also present in the grapes, both the skins and seeds. And if you have a really tannic wine, you want to eat a fatty food. That's why red wines are classically paired with meat. A ribeye steak will pair really nicely with a big cab. Zinfandel, since it kind of has that berry sweetness to it, pairs really well with sweeter meats, like things with barbecue sauce. It's quite often served at barbecues with roasted meats, things like that. And the sort of spicy character of the Zinfandel pairs really well with things like that. And yeah, anytime you have a tannic wine, pair it with something fatty, and your whole opinion will change of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people underestimate how much different foods will change your experience of the wine.
Completely, yeah. It really is amazing.
And then speaking of eating and drinking, what is your favorite wine to make and your favorite wine to drink?
I don't know if I have a favorite wine to make. They're all my children, you know. Can you pick among your children? They all have different characteristics. I definitely have a soft spot in my heart for Pinot. That was one of my first internships. So in Burgundy, working in all those Pinot vineyards, that was a lot of fun. Pinot's kind of unforgiving though, because if you make a mistake, it doesn't have enough oomph to hide it. So from a winemaker's crafting point of view, I think Chardonnay is always fun. Cabernet is always fun, just because Chardonnay, it's a blank canvas. You can create whatever you want on it by layering on oak and other flavors. Well, mostly just oak, but then trying to enhance the other characteristics of the wine, try to bring out the citrus or try to bring out more of a ripe fruit character. And then Cab can take layers and layers of oak, whatever you want to put at it, and then just kind of build up that mouthfeel, and that's always fun. But I find at home I drink a lot of Pinot just because it pairs well with so many things. It's more acidic and more bright, but it's light enough that, you know, like salmon and Pinot actually go pretty well together, whereas most other red wines you wouldn't drink with fish. And then Pinot still goes well with chicken and pork, and then, you know, heavier meats, I'll still drink a Pinot. You know, who am I kidding? But I find in our house that we don't have any Pinot in the closet. It's all gone. I'll fill in the blank space. So Pinot at Sebastiani, we have the 3 vineyards in Carneros. We do Chardonnay and Pinot out of them. And so we've done Pinot here for a long time. Not as long as we've done Cab. Sebastiani is one of the first wineries in California to do a varietally labeled Cab, but we've been doing Pinot for many years now. Carneros is a nice site. It's not quite as austere as you get out on you know, in the cooler parts of the Russian River. It's definitely going to be riper than Burgundy is for the most part. But for me, Carneros Pinot is nice. It's got a little more weight, tends towards black olive, black cherry, a little more weight. And you know, the funny thing I find about Carneros Pinot is a lot of people will kind of dismiss it as being too heavy. But the last time I went to Burgundy, one of the winemakers who was tasting with us said, "Oh, hold on 1 second. I have something that you won't believe." And he runs down into his cellar and comes back up with a bottle, and he's got the label hidden, and he pours everybody a taste. And it's this very, very ripe Pinot. It doesn't really taste like Burgundy. And of course, knowing the recent history of Burgundy, I said, "Oh, is that a 2003?" And he said, "How did you know?" It's like every French winemaker always thinks it's amazing, but this is what we get every year.
If you had the choice and you could make wine in any one region in the world, and I'll break it down to even AVA, because I don't want you just saying France on me. So, and I think I might know the answer based on some of your previous you know, stories and whatnot. But if you could make anywhere that wine that wasn't Sonoma, and I'll eliminate Sonoma because, you know, it's home field advantage. I get it.
Yeah, right.
But if you had to go somewhere else and be a consulting winemaker in some other AVA, where would you pick?
Oh, I'd love to go back to Burgundy. That would be, yeah.
Sure.
go to the farmer's market every Saturday in Bone and, you know, get your bread and
Sure.
yeah.
All the delicious non-pasteurized cheeses you can handle.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Perfect for Pinot.
Perfect for Pinot. Yeah.
You have a favorite vintage since you've been at Sebastiani? Any ones that have challenged you or surprised you or maybe given you a tough time in the field, but came out to be a really meaningful harvest once you bottled?
Yeah, well, you know, I've been pretty lucky. I've been here 4 years, and every vintage has been pretty good. It's been a good string. 16 was a tiny crop, so it's kind of like, well, we didn't hardly make any wine. It's mostly gone because there just wasn't. There was rain and wind during bloom, which knocks the grapes off the clusters. 17 was a particularly nice year. The 17s were really nice. We were lucky enough that we had picked almost everything before the fires came through. So I don't know if everybody remembers, but California had a bunch of wildfires right in this region in 17. And we were actually shut down for 8 days, which was very nerve-wracking, to say the least. We weren't sure if we were going to get back in, what was going to happen. The fires came within about a quarter mile of the town here. So yeah, you can actually see up on the ridge line where the fire was actually finally stopped. So that was pretty bad. And we had all the tanks full of grapes. And so they just sat there for 8 days. And at the end of 8 days, we got everything going again. And it made me realize that we do far too much work in the winery because most of those wines came out really good. It's like, why are we pumping it over 3 times a day? This wine sat here for 8 days with nothing and it's great.
Yeah.
So one of those learning lessons. It's not something you'd ever try, but not having a choice, it's like, oh, maybe I can only pump over once a day. I don't really need to pump over that much.
Is there anything at the vineyard or, you know, in any of the wine clubs that, you know, maybe you're growing small lots of or experimenting with, or, you know, might be really, really limited or special that, you know, you maybe want to educate us about here in the New York market that we don't necessarily have access to?
Yeah, we have a pretty good selection of wines for our wine club. Actually, the red I brought, I don't know if you can see that, but this is Barbera.
I can see it says Sebastiani.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway.
Oh, Barbera. Okay.
It's a Barbera, yeah.
Yeah.
It's from a nice site up on Sonoma Mountain, and it's a really nice wine. That's something that we do just for wine club. We do a couple. We do what we call Old Vines Cab, which is from the former winemaker Mark Lyon. He owns a vineyard in Alexander Valley up by Cloverdale, and so we do a single vineyard bottling out of that called Old Vines. We do another one called Gravel Bed because it's on a gravel bar right along the banks of or about 50 yards back from the banks of the Russian River, but it's old riverbed soil, and it makes a very distinct wine.
And you guys play a little bit with bourbon barrel aging also, correct?
We have a bourbon barrel aged product. I wish I could create a great story about the barrels we use, but we've done it 2 years now, and we've used different barrels each year. I like the barrels we did this year, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get them again because they were like a closeout from a distillery that was going bankrupt. So yeah, it's like, oh well.
So what do you feel that the bourbon barrel aging imparts on the wine that's a little bit different than you know, are you using traditionally American oak or French oak or a combination?
The bourbon barrel by law has to be American oak. So bourbon is to be called bourbon, it has to be aged in new American oak. And the traditional bourbon barrel toast is actually a char where they burn the inside of the barrel. And it gives a real rich caramely flavor. And there's a little bit of sweetness that comes from the way the oak is toasted. And it just adds a nice depth of flavor. I'm not sure I'd want to drink it every night, but it's fun from time to time. It's a nice change of pace.
It's a lot like the Zinfandel in that if you have food that can stand up to it, it's a really fun wine to drink.
Yeah, exactly.
Barbecue or burgers or those bolder flavors that can really be a good co-host. But it can be a little tough to just chew on its own.
Yeah, it's not a wine you want to stand around with a glass. You want to have a plate of something in front of you at the same time.
Yeah. So Brianna had submitted a question here. She was curious about last year's fires. I know you touched on 17 a little bit, but was 19 a similar situation? Were they as close in 19 or?
No, the fires in 19 were mostly pretty far away from us. We were real lucky in that regard. They were at the north end of Sonoma County for the most part, or other parts of the state. We did see a couple vineyards affected by smoke a little bit, but nothing anything like 17. It was all over much quicker and affected a smaller area, so that was pretty lucky. And it seems I've worked in four smoke affected vintages now in my career, and it seems like when the smoke hits the grapes late in the season, the effect isn't as bad. The grapes aren't really pulling in that much anymore. You know, they're not really building up. They're almost done building up sugar. They're not really pulling in nutrients from the vine to keep growing and getting bigger. And so they don't seem to absorb as much smoke. 2008, the fires were in July, while the grapes were really in the beginning of their ripening phase. And those wines, man, that stuff tasted horrible. And we haven't seen anything like that.
Have you seen any of the effects personally of climate change? The vines coming, awake a little bit earlier in the season, or a little hotter days and cooler nights, or has there been any kind of a direct correlation between what's going on with the more global level weather patterns?
Yeah, we see it a little bit. I mean, we're getting, we get slightly earlier bloom every year. I think we're 2 or 3 weeks ahead of the historical average now, for the last few years. This year was actually really scary because January it hit 85 degrees, and you could actually see the buds of the vines start to swell. But at that point, you still have 3 months of frost possible. So it's just once the vines push their buds, they're really susceptible to cold weather. So we thought we were going to have a really tough year on our hands. And then February, it cooled back down into the 40s, and it was like, oh, okay. And the vines hadn't moved along far enough along; they just went back to sleep. And we ended up having a cool spring. So, I don't know. I think what global warming has done for us is it's really heightened the climate extremes. We still sort of have averages for the year, for the season, but it seems like very few days are the average. Like last week it was 97 one day, and then 2 days later it was 72.
Oh, wow.
So it's you're just seeing these big swings.
Yeah, Sonoma is kind of famous for the diurnal shift there to begin with, just because the days can be so hot when the sun is in full effect, and then as soon as nightfall happens, you're dropping 40 plus degrees in a matter of
routinely.
That's shorts during the day and hoodies at night for sure. Do you have an opinion on corks versus synthetic cork, real screw stelvin enclosure? Where do you stand on the dying breed that is natural cork?
I like natural corks. They've gotten better in the last few years. They've really upped their quality control, where you can buy a cork now where they guarantee it won't have TCA. So that's been nice. I'm not a big fan of the synthetic corks. I've had some bad experiences with them. Some of the materials seem to be a little bit porous, and they absorb the aroma molecules, because a lot of the aroma molecules are hydrocarbons, and as like dissolves like, as you say in chemistry, and so the cork will actually suck in those those aroma molecules, and it'll strip the wine. The newer Stelvins are really nice. If you just make a few adjustments to your winemaking, you don't get that reductive character you can sometimes get with a screw cap. So you just have to kind of treat it, understanding it's going under screw cap, and it's a great closure, and you don't need to have a corkscrew with you, which is also really nice.
Great for a picnic.
Yeah, it's great for a picnic. You can sneak them into movie theaters.
Movie theater? I'm not familiar. What are those?
Yeah, I can't remember. There was something they used to go to in the old days. Something in the past.
All right. Anybody else have any other questions, comments? I think Stephen was wondering possibly where to get the Barbera, and I think you had mentioned that that's part of the wine club.
Yeah, it's the wine club, and I think you can get it on the website sometimes, depending on how much we have in stock. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time here, David. It's been wonderful and informative, and I really appreciate you hanging in there. As Jessica mentioned earlier, this has been a few times rescheduled and sideswiped by everything up into and including a global pandemic. So we appreciate your patience, and we love to have fellow Yaleys to be able to share the love of wine and bring us all into our living rooms and share your knowledge with us. And thanks again for taking the time and making some really fun and approachable wines, and cheers to you, and really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. And if you ever make it out to Sebastiani, have them give me a ring. If I'm not too busy, I'm glad to give you a little tour. And I wish I could have made it out there this spring, but like you said, global pandemic's hard to beat. And cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.